He made America laugh for 3 decades. Yet behind those smiles, Johnny Carson kept a secret list of comedians he believed were truly cruel. To the world, he remained the perfect host, polite, charming, endlessly professional. Known as Mr. Television and Uncle Milty, he dominated the late 1940s and early 1950s so completely that restaurants reportedly closed on Tuesday nights so customers could watch his show. Berle embodied the birth of mass entertainment, and, according to Carson's later observations, the birth of televised arrogance. Milton was the prototype, said a former Tonight Show talent coordinator. He proved you could be brilliant and unbearable at the same time. Behind the laughter, Berle's rule was absolute. He bullied writers, mocked younger comedians, and filled every room with the weight of his ego. His reputation for stealing jokes was legendary. He would attend other comics' acts, scribble down their best lines, and use them on television without permission. To Carson, whose reverence for originality bordered on moral principle, this was not merely plagiarism, but betrayal. Even worse were the stories that circulated through NBC about Berle's off-color behavior. His obsession with crude jokes, his habit of exposing himself to coworkers to prove a point, his endless boasting about his anatomy. But in private, his view of certain comedians changed permanently. He didn't just tell dirty jokes, one longtime employee recalled. He lived them. Carson found such behavior indefensible, not because it was vulgar, but because it humiliated people who could not fight back. To him, comedy was supposed to elevate, not degrade. Milton believed he was untouchable. A producer remembered, Johnny believed no one should be. Rosie O'Donnell, the Queen of Nice, and the cost of a manufactured persona. If Berle represented the old order of unchecked power, Rosie O'Donnell symbolized its modern evolution, the weaponization of image. In the late 1990s, her daytime talk show made her America's Queen of Nice. She gave away gifts, championed causes, and built a multi-million-dollar brand on empathy and inclusiveness. Yet within the industry, rumors told a different story. He confided to trusted colleagues that some of the industry's biggest names were, in his words, genuinely awful human beings. Rosie could charm an audience and terrorize a control room in the same hour, said a television director who worked with her. Former producers described a workplace ruled by temper, unpredictable rages, and emotional exhaustion. Carson, by then retired but still connected to many NBC veterans, took note. He recognized the pattern immediately, the cultivated warmth concealing a core of volatility. He used to say, "The camera doesn't lie." At least not forever, recalled one former executive. He knew that kind of facade always cracks. When O'Donnell's public feuds with co-hosts on The View and her on-air confrontations with celebrities began making headlines, Carson's prediction seemed prophetic. The persona that had once made her beloved became a liability. For Carson, this was not schadenfreude, it was confirmation. He believed that credibility, the audience's trust, was a performer's most fragile asset. These were not differences of opinion or clashing egos. Once hypocrisy touched it, no amount of laughter could restore it. Lucille Ball, America's favorite redhead, with an iron grip of all the names on Carson's quiet list, none provoked more ambivalence than Lucille Ball. To millions, she was the embodiment of joy itself, the lovable, scatterbrained Lucy Ricardo who turned domestic chaos into high art. Her comedic precision and groundbreaking role as the first woman to own a major television studio made her a pioneer. But Carson's admiration came with unease. She was beloved publicly, but iron-fisted privately, recalled an NBC executive who had worked with both. At Desilu Productions, Ball's authority was absolute. Writers described her as brilliant, demanding, and often merciless. She fired employees over minor disagreements, shredded scripts in meetings, and expected every creative decision to pass through her hands. "Funny on screen, fierce and frightening off it," said one producer. They were moments of moral clarity, snapshots of hypocrisy so vivid that even decades later, Carson's associates could recall them in exact detail. Carson understood the pressures she faced as one he's operating in a male-dominated industry that rarely tolerated assertive womenage. But he could not excuse what he saw as the erosion of basic humanity. Unlike burlesque vanity or O'Donnell's volatility, Ball's severity seemed born from fear, the fear of losing control, of being dismissed in a world that doubted women's authority. Carson respected her genius, yet pitied the isolation it created. Greatness doesn't require cruelty, he reportedly told a colleague, but show business often teaches the opposite. As these stories accumulated, a larger pattern emerged, one that troubled Carson long after the cameras stopped rolling. The more famous the comedian, the more insulated they became. Power and adulation acted as armor, protecting them from accountability. Audiences adored them, executives protected them, and employees endured them. The result was an ecosystem where abuse could flourish unchecked, disguised as eccentricity or creative temperament. From the outside, Hollywood's comedy circuit seemed like a fraternity of good-natured performers united by laughter. Carson had spent his career mastering silence, pauses that could generate laughter or unease. In his private reflections, that same silence became a form of moral witness. He rarely confronted offenders directly, but he never forgot them. He believed the worst punishment, one writer said, was to remember everything. Publicly, these entertainers remained untouchable. Privately, they were eroding the moral fabric of the industry they helped build. Carson saw the contradiction, chronicled it in his mind, and warned those who would listen. Fame, he believed, was the great distorting lens. It magnified kindness when it existed, and cruelty when it was hidden. In time, even the brightest reputations began to crack under their own weight. The laughter, once effortless, now sounded rehearsed. Inside, Carson saw something far darker, performers who preached warmth and humility to the public while privately cultivating arrogance, manipulation, and abuse. The smiles looked forced. And the audience, the one truth Hollywood could never control, started to sense that something was off. Fame protects the cruel until the audience decides to look closer. Every secret list reaches its breaking point, the moment when what was once private observation becomes moral revelation. For Johnny Carson, that moment arrived as he watched two very different performers expose in opposite ways how comedy could deform the human spirit. One was reckless, the other monstrous. Both confirmed his deepest fear that laughter, when weaponized, could erase empathy entirely. Buddy Hackett, when humor became a shield. Buddy Hackett never pretended to be gentle. His humor was crude, physical, and unapologetically vulgar. Audiences loved his audacity, the squinting face, the nasal voice, the fearless jokes that tiptoed over every social boundary. He understood better than most that television could create illusions of virtue, and he took note of those who used that illusion to hide their real nature. But behind the curtain, the boundaries he crossed were no longer punchlines. They were people. He didn't tell jokes backstage, recalled a former Tonight Show page. He tested limits. Multiple employees described the same pattern: the lingering touches, the offhand remarks about women's bodies, the laughter that felt like intimidation. To outsiders, Hackett's behavior was dismissed as harmless mischief, the antics of a wild man. To those on set, it was exhausting and humiliating. Carson's relationship with Hackett was conflicted. Professionally, he admired the man's timing. Personally, he was disturbed by his lack of restraint. During one taping, after a female staffer complained about Hackett's advances, Carson privately confronted the comic clown, not with anger, but with measured disappointment. The former host never published his list. "Teresa's lying," he told him. "Once you cross it, it stops being comedy." The warning changed nothing. Hackett continued to blur the line until there was no distinction between act and impulse. "Johnny was old-fashioned in the best way," said a producer. "He thought decency wasn't optional, it was part of the job." Hackett's inability to grasp that truth marked him, in Carson's mind, as the cautionary tale of his generation, a performer consumed by his own caricature, mistaking shock for honesty, vulgarity for courage. Bill Cosby, the monster behind the sweater. If Hackett's offenses were visible to anyone who cared to look, Bill Cosby's were buried beneath the most convincing disguise Hollywood ever built. To millions, he was America's moral compass, the father figure who taught patience, discipline, and family values through The Cosby Show. To Carson and a handful of insiders, the performance rang false. Yet fragments of it survive through the recollections of producers, writers, and stagehands who worked beside him for years. During the early 1980s, as Cosby's stardom reached its peak, Carson quietly began distancing himself. There was no public feud, no explicit explanation. But those inside The Tonight Show noticed. Cosby's name came up in guest meetings, one staffer recalled. Johnny just shook his head and said, "Not right now." That was all. Decades later, when dozens of women came forward with allegations of drugging and assault, that cryptic instinct seemed less like rumor and more like foresight. According to colleagues, Carson had heard whisper stories pass quietly among network employees and entertainment reporters, stories that never made print because Cosby's legal team and celebrity status suppressed them. "Hollywood is small," said a former NBC executive. Word travels. For 30 years, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was the nation's nightly ritual. Their testimonies paint a disturbing portrait of a hidden moral hierarchy inside comedy, a system in which success often excused cruelty and fame silenced those who suffered from it. Johnny didn't repeat gossip, but he listened. And once he believed someone was dangerous, that was it. The decision to ban or limit Cosby's appearances came at a real cost. The comedian's presence guaranteed high ratings, and producers pressed to keep him on the lineup. Carson refused. He would rather lose a point in the Nielsen ratings, the executive said, than give airtime to someone he couldn't respect. Carson's caution was not moral grandstanding, it was self-protection. He understood the fragility of reputation, the way one moment of association could stain decades of integrity. When the Cosby scandal finally erupted in the 2010s, many who had known Carson revisited his quiet defiance with new respect. "He knew," said one former writer. "Tonight, we reconstruct that unseen record. He always knew." In retrospect, Cosby represented the ultimate inversion of everything Carson valued. Here was a man who preached virtue but practiced exploitation, who built an empire on trust and used it as camouflage. "He wore a sweater," one producer remarked bitterly, "but he left a cold trail." Carson's theory of broken laughter. After decades in television, Carson came to a conclusion that haunted him. Some comedians were not broken despite their success. They were broken because of it. In conversations with writers, he outlined a private theory of corruption. Laughter, he said, is a form of power, and power in the wrong hands becomes cruelty disguised as charm. He believed the craft of comedy demanded emotional distance, a capacity to observe human pain without being overwhelmed by it. But for certain personalities, that distance became detachment. From the self-proclaimed humanitarian who turned charity into ego to the beloved family entertainer who hid monstrous secrets, this is the story of 8 comedians Johnny Carson knew were not what they seemed. The audience's laughter acted as anesthesia, numbing whatever empathy remained. Those who once turned pain into humor eventually turned humor into dominance, seers proving, night after night, that they could control a crowd, humiliate a victim, and still be rewarded for it. Carson recognized shades of this in himself, the guarded emotions, the solitude after the show, the quiet dissatisfaction that success never erased. But unlike those on his blacklist, he treated self-awareness as a discipline. He insisted on courtesy towards staff, respect for boundaries, and humility in public life. He knew his own flaws, said his longtime producer. He just refused to make them anyone else's problem. For Carson, the lesson was painfully simple. Comedy was not salvation. It was reflection. When wielded with empathy, it could heal. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms are really driving this crisis? When wielded without it, it became an instrument of harm. The 8 names on his mental listen, each celebrated, each admired to prove that talent alone could never purify the soul behind it. Johnny believed the job was to make people laugh, the producer continued, not to change the world, not to be worshipped, Dak, just to make living rooms a little lighter for a few minutes. That humility, he believed, was what kept him from crossing the same invisible line that swallowed so many others. In the end, Carson never revealed his list publicly. He did not need to. The truth revealed itself, one scandal, one obituary, one retrospective at a time. The audience that once applauded in blind trust eventually learned to look beyond the spotlight, just as he had. Perhaps that was the real purpose of his private reckoning, not revenge, but preservation. We will analyze every detail from the first cracks in their reputations to the irreversible damage to understand how the entertainment world works and how even laughter can mask something profoundly dark. A reminder to future generations of entertainers that the stage amplifies everything, including the parts of the soul one hopes to hide. As one friend later said, Johnny never stopped laughing. He just learned what laughter could cost. The curtain always falls. The lights fade, the laughter dissolves into memory, and what remains is the recording, not of jokes told, but of how people were treated when the camera stopped. For Johnny Carson, that record became his silent legacy. He never wrote a tell-all book, never exposed anyone publicly, never claimed moral superiority. Yet those who knew him understood that his private judgments shaped an unspoken code for an industry that often forgot its conscience. In the years after his retirement, Carson rarely appeared in public. When he did, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined his television presence. The culture of American television during the 1960s and 1970s was built on illusion. To younger hosts who sought his advice, his guidance was deceptively simple. Be kind to your crew, listen to your writers, and never believe the applause. It was both philosophy and warning. He had seen too many performers confuse laughter with love, ratings with virtue, and fame with immunity. As the scandals of later decades unfolded, Rosie O'Donnell's televised meltdowns, Cosby's criminal trial, and the steady stream of exposés revealing toxic workplaces and manipulative star zone. Carson's private list began to look less like gossip and more like prophecy. He wasn't cynical, one of his former producers reflected. He was realistic. He knew that show business runs on illusion, and illusions can hide anything, even evil. The lesson he left behind was not about punishment, but about proportion. Fame magnifies everything: talent, insecurity, cruelty, and grace. Those who forget that equation inevitably destroy themselves. Every night, bright lights, live laughter, and polished monologues created the sense that comedy was pure joy, a harmless escape from politics, tension, or personal struggle. Carson believed that comedy, at its best, was an act of humility, a momentary surrender of ego for the sake of shared laughter. At its worst, it was a mirror turned away from the audience, reflecting only the performer's need for control. Authenticity is the comedian's only currency, he once told a friend. Without it, no career could survive the scrutiny of time. In that sense, Carson's mental blacklist was never about condemnation. It was about preservations of decency, of craft, of the fragile trust between performer and public. Decades after his final broadcast, that trust remains the true currency of entertainment. In a culture where exposure comes faster than reflection, Carson's restraint feels almost radical. He believed that silence could be moral, that the most ethical response to cruelty was refusal, not applause, not complicity, not another invitation to the show. In the end, Johnny Carson was not the hero or the judge of comedy. He was its witness. Yet behind those stage curtains, a different ecosystem thrived, one fueled by ego, hierarchy, and unspoken cruelty. He loved the sound of laughter, but he also understood its cost. And perhaps that is why his legacy endures. Because he taught an industry addicted to noise that integrity, like humor, depends on timing. If this story changed how you see comedy and the people behind it, subscribe for more untold truths. Because behind every spotlight, there is always a shadow waiting to be understood. Johnny Carson, a man celebrated for his restraint and composure, became both participant and observer in this strange theater of contradiction. Carson's own temperament made him uniquely sensitive to hypocrisy. Millions tuned in for laughter, charm, and a comforting sense that everything in show business was as bright as the studio lights. He was private, methodical, and allergic to false charm. Crew members recall that he could tell within seconds whether a guest's kindness was genuine or rehearsed. He had no patience for grandstanding or self-importance. As one former producer put it, Johnny judged people by how they treated the lowest person on the call sheet. That simple measure became his moral compass. Over the years, it guided who he admired and who he quietly avoided. By the mid-1970s, Carson's backstage experiences had given shape to what his staff jokingly referred to as the Blacklist that nobody wanted to be on. It was never written down, never discussed publicly, but everyone sensed its presence. When a certain guest name came up in production meetings, Carson's silence said everything. The decision was subtle: fewer invitations, less enthusiasm, a cool politeness on air. But when the applause faded and the guests walked off stage, Carson often saw what no audience ever did: the moment when the joke stopped and the cruelty began. To casual viewers, nothing seemed amiss. To those inside the studio, the signal was unmistakable. The patter began with one man, Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis, the humanitarian with a heart of stone. To the American public, Jerry Lewis was the face of selfless charity. His annual muscular dystrophy telethons raised millions. His slapstick characters radiated innocence, and his tears on camera seemed to prove a bottomless compassion. But according to Carson's staff, Lewis' off-camera demeanor was a study in cruelty. Stage managers and interns described a performer who treated subordinates as expendable. He arrived at The Tonight Show with an entourage that obeyed every whim, demanded brand-specific water, and berated assistants for the smallest errors. A former female production assistant once carried the wrong message into his dressing room during a 1970s taping. What happened next became legend within the NBC corridors. Lewis exploded in a tirade so vicious that the young woman quit television altogether. According to several longtime producers and crew members, Carson possessed what one of them called a photographic memory for cruelty. When Carson heard about it, he personally intervened, ordering the executive producer to deliver an apology on behalf of the network. "Johnny was livid," recalled the cameraman. "He said anyone who could do that didn't deserve to make people laugh." Carson's disgust deepened as stories from Lewis' personal life surfaced. Estranged family members, an abandoned daughter, and, most disturbingly, accounts of him mocking disabled children offstage after tearful performances in front of them. The dichotomy enraged Carson. To him, Lewis symbolized everything wrong with the industry, the transformation of genuine empathy into performative sentimentality. Don Rickles, when the insults never stopped. If Jerry Lewis embodied hypocrisy through false virtue, Don Rickles represented cruelty mistaken for comedy. His public identity as Mr. Warmth was a brilliant irony, an insult comic whose very nickname was the joke. On air, Rickles was electrifying, sharp, fast, devastatingly funny. He could watch a comedian captivate millions, then seconds later berate an assistant or humiliate a staff member, and he never forgot it. Off-air, according to Carson's colleagues, the performance never ended. "Don didn't have an off switch," said one former writer. "He'd insult the janitor the same way. He'd insult Frank Sinatra just without the punchline. The difference was that celebrities could laugh it off, employees could not." Behind closed doors, Rickles' biting remarks turned personal. He mocked physical appearance, belittled assistants, and berated crew members who failed to meet his impossible standards. Carson admired Rickles' timing and courage on stage, but found his personal cruelty unsettling. Humor, in Carson's philosophy, required empathy. Without it, comedy became a weapon. "He never turned it off," Carson once told a producer. Off camera, he quietly kept score. "He just turned it on you." Though Rickles remained a frequent guest, his ratings guaranteed eye ties. The friendship between host and comic stayed strictly professional. Carson knew talent when he saw it, but he also knew a bully when he met one. Bob Hope, the patriot with a private agenda. If Rickles' cruelty was loud, Bob Hope's was silent and strategic. Hope was America's comedic ambassador, a fixture of World War II morale tours, the very embodiment of wholesome patriotism. Yet those who worked with both Hope and Carson described a far more cynical man behind the curtain. Hope's carefully curated image as a loyal husband and national treasure concealed a personal life defined by infidelity and manipulation. Former NBC executives and writers alleged a decades-long pattern of extramarital affairs, many involving women who worked under him. Carson, who revered Hope's early work for the troops, was disturbed by the disconnect between the hero America worshipped and the opportunist Hollywood tolerated. "He brought laughs to war zones," one producer said, "but heartbreak to hotel rooms." Over the years, this unspoken ledger became known among those closest to him as Johnny's Blacklist, a mental record of stars whose kindness on camera was nothing more than a performance. Carson's unease extended to Hope's political entanglements. As the comedian's career waned, he maintained influence by courting presidents from both parties, using his access to preserve his celebrity long after his jokes had lost their edge. To Carson, who believed comedy's role was to challenge power, not cling to it, Hope represented a betrayal of the craft itself. By the end, noted a Tonight Show writer, Bob understood power better than humor, and that frightened Johnny. Through these encounters, Carson's mental list began to take shape not as vengeance, but as documentation. He wasn't collecting enemies, he was collecting evidence. In his mind, cruelty, hypocrisy, and ego were symptoms of the same disease, fame without self-awareness. Each of these men reminded him of what could happen when laughter became a mask, rather than a mirror. As one of his producers later reflected, Johnny saw things we didn't want to see. We saw entertainers. Carson never used the list publicly, nor did he confront its subjects on air. He saw warning signs. The laughter was national, but the cruelty was personal, and Johnny never forgot either. What do you think about this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. By the late 20th century, the American entertainment industry had learned how to polish its stars until they gleamed. Variety shows, daytime talk programs, and sitcom reruns created the illusion of intimacy. Hannity X. Viewers believed they knew the people who made them laugh. Yet the gulf between image and reality was widening. Johnny Carson, who had spent decades navigating both worlds, understood that fame was not a mirror but a mask. Behind that mask, three names stood out for the damage they inflicted on everyone who worked beneath them. Milton Berle, the first television star, and the tyranny of ego. Before Carson ever stepped onto the national stage, Milton Berle had already rewritten television history.